Hello and welcome to Module 4, the view from above. So what I'm referring to here is the top of the pyramid, the relatively small number of employees at the top of an organizational hierarchy who largely determine how an organization's mission will be carried out, what tasks and in what order and how will they be done. If you have already read the little joke here from an older edition of Wilson, I'm not sure if it's still in the new edition, but what she's referring to is that managers quite often don't seem to do much. In some cases, they don't. In other cases, they're just not visible. And I'm actually an advocate for managers who are do a lot but are more or less invisible in the workplace. And why would I say that? Well, a manager who has trained and empowered their employees to do their jobs effectively uh, doesn't need to be there all the time, except perhaps in the early stages of a new employee's development. They should eventually be able to step back from that job after they've given the employee a good sense of their expectations, how to perform to those expectations, provided the kind of support that the employee may need to achieve that performance level, given them feedback when they have or have not met that performance level, how to correct their poor performance if it is poor, and whether the employee is um, setting a good standard for long-term employment. If the employee is not doing well after all the other things have been done, the employee still deserves some warning that their job may be in jeopardy if they don't meet certain standards, given the support and whatnot that they've received. So in this module, I will talk about some uh, some of the what is management to begin with, but also some of the theory with respect to um, the formative, I guess, theory on management and how it, you'll be able to see maybe perhaps how it influences our views of management today and how our views of management changed, and and then what it's like to be a manager as a profession, what it might be like to be in the middle of the management hierarchy. So not everybody gets to be at the top of the hierarchy, and many managers progress below the lowest levels of the management um, hierarchy, um, and then what it's like to be a manager. Period, depending on your gender, your sex, and and then what does management look like when we stand back a little bit, when we develop some critical distance from management. And then finally, if you're wondering, and I'm sure some of you are already saying this to yourself, how am I going to use this? And of course, what you're expressing, the need you're expressing is, how can I function as a manager? When do we start learning about being a functional manager? So for those folks, you'll find the very last slide is it's tentatively titled "How to Perform a Disciplinary Investigation." But what you'll find in that list of the how-tos, that it also gives you all kinds of very specific hints of how to be a good manager. So I left that to the end, and you can skip forward to the end, or you can skip it all together. We're actually that is also going to be available to us for an assignment that comes up after the midterm break. So I'm introducing it now because this is a chapter on management, and I think it would help you to understand what a good manager does. And then later on, when we get to that assignment, you should also find it very useful because the assignment involves a disciplinary issue of an employee at a company called Hydro One. This is a real life example from about not even 10 years ago in Ontario. So, as in all of this material, I'd ask you to reflect on your own experience and any managers that you might have had and how they either impressed or didn't impress you. So, the purpose of all of this material, and really, I hope all of your business material in your BBA program, is to be able to observe what's going on around you. Um, the technology and the social relations of business or of management more generally, and use these tools to apply to what you're observing to come up with a possible explanation and perhaps even a prediction of future performance or behavior in order to, to behave more creatively and effectively in the workplace. That's what all of this material is about. So it may not feel like it's immediately useful to you, but trust me, it is. If you understand the things we've already been talking about, you will, and you apply them to your, experience and your observations in the workplace, you will be a better manager if that's what you want to be. So how do we define management? Um, Apparently, the root of the word manage is comes from a Greek origin, which essentially means to handle a horse. To manage a horse. How do you manage a horse? And so somehow this became uh, complicit with how we manage people. So anyway, so think about that image of, what do you do to make a horse do what you want it to do, and then think, wait a second, I'm trying to manage people, not horses. Now horses are very intelligent, but hopefully people are more intelligent than horses. So a couple of definitions that seem to compete with each other. One is that management is the mental work or thinking, intuiting, feeling work performed by people in an organizational context. A sort of competing or alternative definition is simply that management is a level in the organizational hierarchy, a position above the position of foreman or first level supervisor. However, when you, again, take some critical distance from managers and management, you might discover that managers do little different than anyone else would do, except for the power and social context that is bequeathed to them and that differentiate managers from non-managers. So you may have heard me talk about this before in an earlier module when I was talking about the different perspectives on management and organization. So, but we'll repeat them here anyway. The management seems to perform under certain assumptions, and you'll find that these assumptions are really not. They're actually encouraged by your business education, your BBA. And some of these assumptions are that there appears to be a belief among managers, that is, and among others as well, who have received a managerial education. And many of you will not be managers, but you are receiving a managerial education. It appears to be a belief in the possibility of a single way of organizing that would have universal efficacy. Another word for efficacy is effectiveness. And it also refers to agency, by the way. Am I as a manager efficacious, or do I have agency? Am I able to take actions that are truly effective? So managerial assumptions also include the idea that management is conceived as a system of expertise which is technically adept, politically neutral, and morally benign. And I'm afraid the opposite is quite true. And you may even find a question in your quiz that sort of alludes to this idea. And in fact, in my research today and over the past several years, I've been most interested in problematizing management for exactly these reasons. That management tends not to be technically adept, tends not to be politically neutral, and tends not to be morally benign. And then finally, that management assumes a set of principles whose application will ensure the smooth operation of any organization. In fact, you can find textbooks where this is, if it's not explicitly stated in the management textbook, it's implicit in the way that the textbook is written, that, that you do all of these things and you're going to have a great organization. But the simple fact is that those things don't guarantee that your organization will be a smooth operation. So as I've already um, begun to communicate to you, that we can question those assumptions. Um, so think about, is there a single way to organize? And then think about how many different kinds of organizations there are and how many different ways there are to organize. And then think about, I've introduced you to some really, radical forms of organization, and they're very effective, very successful forms of organization. And they do things quite differently than the stuff you're learning in your BBA program. So, insinuating or implying that there's a single best way to organize that has universal efficacy, that would be bad advice. There are other ways of doing things. There are always alternatives, and the more educated you are, not educated in the business sense, but educated in history, in sociology, in psychology, in well, whatever else I'm leaving, science even, actually, for that matter, physics, chemistry, and so on. The broader the education you have, in my mind, the better manager you could be, because you are much more likely to be able to imagine these alternatives. Um, and so I've already questioned the notion of management as a system of expertise. It is not, as I said, I deliberately problematize management. Um, and in terms of a set of principles that we can apply universally, again, there's a tremendous diversity of successful organizations out there. And depending on how you measure the success of an organization, some organizations that don't look anything like what you're studying in your business program are even more successful than the corporations you're studying in your business program. It just depends on how you measure success. So there's a fair amount of background in the chapter on early thinkers on management, and one was a Frenchman named Fayol, who he really wasn't a researcher, he wasn't an academic, he was basically a manager, a practitioner of some sort, and he just sort of mused on what he did as a manager. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm not sure which it is, but well, it's probably a little bit of unfortunate. But his thinking continued and still continues to shape and influence how we think about managers as rational beings who carry out rational tasks. And so he just basically, took his own anecdotal, observations and turned them into a framework for management, which still shows up in management textbooks. Not this one, but in most other management textbooks. So he described management as the planning, organizing, motivating, controlling, and coordinating. I remember this showing up in my own first management textbook a long, long time ago as planning, organizing, directing, and controlling. So, you can see how directing might incorporate both motivation and coordination. And so we use the acronym PODC, planning, organizing, directing, and controlling. But it was an idealized notion, and it didn't necessarily represent what managers actually did in real life, in real time. So several decades have passed when Stewart shows up. And one of the big differences between Stewart and the earlier work of Fayol, for instance, is that she actually went out and studied managers, 160 in particular. She did a form of research based on the observation of diaries, what managers actually write about their days, their work days. And so these managers carried around a diary for 4 weeks and recorded their observations about what they did in the run of their day, week, and month. What she found was that discussions were dominant at up to 50% of the time spent. And so this, right off the top, we see that her findings are contradictory to Fayol's, very rational approach, where managers spend all kinds of time planning and then organizing, and in fact, what she found was that they didn't spend much time in planning. So their activities were very short, brevity of most activities, shortness of their activities. They spent very little time when they weren't interrupted, and if the manager wasn't being interrupted by somebody else, they actually interrupted themselves, just to I guess because they had a hard time focusing. Maybe they were suffering from ADHD. I'm not sure. Anyway, from based on her observations of the diaries, she categorized managers into five sort of types. One is the emissary, so that you can imagine this is the person who goes out and makes linkages to other parts of the organization or even outside the organization. Writers, people who write memos, to discuss or enlighten the troops, the employees about their thoughts and how to do things. The discussers, people who go out and discuss and discuss and discuss with whoever will listen to them. And then the troubleshooters, people who sort of parachute in when there is trouble, and a sort of reactive kind of mode of operation, reacting to trouble or problems in the workplace. And then the committee men, and she's being fairly literal here because so many managers back certainly in the 1970s and before women really started moving into the workplace, into the management ranks of the workplace, it was almost all men, and the committee men then sat on committees over and over and over again, and their days seemed to be made up of moving from one committee meeting to another. So continuing with Stewart's work, she said that she concluded, I guess you'd say, she found that it was clear from her work that management is not a single activity requiring uniform knowledge and a common body of knowledge. So here we are. Now just think about this contradiction. Here we are in a business school that is attempting to transfer to you a common body of knowledge. And her first finding, one of the earliest sort of observational studies of what managers actually do, and she's concluding the opposite. Oh, that's kind of interesting. And maybe that ties into what I said on an earlier slide, that what might be better preparation to be a manager is something we might describe as a liberal education today. Literature, history, art, science, and so on, and maybe less business management. She also claimed it's misleading to talk about a manager's job or an average manager because there's such diversity in the real world. And finally, that how the managers spend their time is determined by the kind of organization, the kind of job, and the characteristics of the individual. So there's a great deal of an idiosyncratic idiosyncratic character of the job of manager and of the person called manager. So right around the same time, a Canadian academic out of McGill University in Montreal, Henry Mintzberg, he's completing his doctoral dissertation, which was about managers. And he studied 5 chief executive officers, CEOs, and he followed them with a stopwatch for only a week. Now compare that to Stewart's work, which was over 4 weeks and 160 managers. So I think Henry got away with pretty. I don't think he could do that today. I don't think you could get a PhD today doing work like that. Anyway, but it was still groundbreaking work because it, largely hadn't been done in academia, studying managers directly. So, um, uh, so he found that managers would report that. Remember those four things that fail, or five things that fail talked about. I say here PODC: planning, organizing, directing, controlling. A very rational approach to management, which is an ideal but not reality. Um, However, work was characterized by an unrelenting pace, brevity, variety, discontinuity. Remember what Stewart said. So his findings, right off the bat, right off the top, I shouldn't be using a euphemism right off the bat, because some of you may not be familiar with that phrase. So right off the top, he seems to agree with Stewart. He had similar findings. He also concluded, though, that there were four myths about managers, and one is that a manager, or the manager, or managers in general, I guess, is a reflective, systematic planner. They don't seem to spend a lot of time doing that. That an effective manager has no regular duties. In fact, he did find that they did have regular duties. There were functions that they performed on a as needed or regular basis. That senior managers need aggregated information, and again, their actual performance didn't seem to involve that kind of performance. And then the idea that management is becoming a science it felt to him ludicrous and didn't reflect reality. And just think about this. There are many universities today where you can still go and get a master's in science in management, a master's or a master's of science in management, MSc management. So what are they saying when a university or a business school, provides a degree like that, a management of science? They're telling the world, oh, this is a science, but in fact, it's probably a lot more like art, or at least as much like art as it is like science. There's more to it than simply applying scientific tools or rational tools. We search for these basic sort of relationships, but the more we search, the more relationships we find, and so to boil social relations, which is management essentially, down to a set of rules or laws, that might work in physics, but it doesn't work nearly as well when you're talking about people and society. So again, he's basically thumbing his nose at the sort of common assumptions. So he found as well, like Stewart, he found that managers perform three main roles: the interpersonal, the information role, receiving and disseminating, and the decision maker role. And then within each of these three, he found them performing other roles, like more defined roles as well. Of course, as I've already pointed out, Mintzberg this was his doctoral dissertation, so this was an early piece of work by Henry. Before he'd become a professor, a full-time professor at least. But as I said, like when you're especially in anything related to sociology or psychology or economics even, sometimes research doesn't have to be good to have an effect, or to have to mold future research, and to be to move the profession. And sometimes it's just as important to be early. One of my professors, my own professor, said either be good or be early. And so in Mintzberg's case, he was early in the game of describing what managers actually do, and he's had a profound effect because of that. And he, even up until just a few years ago, he was still quite active as a professor emeritus at McGill University. Um, so one of the issues uh, with some of the issues with his work was that he wasn't really explaining; he was just sort of categorizing. Didn't do a lot of explanation, and his work also tended to lack a specificity. And the relationship between role and organizational effectiveness was not really clear. And of course, today in research, some form of effectiveness is almost always the point of the research, and that's one of the powerful things about academic research in management today, but it's also one of the weaknesses, which may sound contradictory. Well, it is contradictory because management is about social relations, and it depends on what kind of outcomes, what kind of effectiveness you're talking about. So still another study by Cotter, a few years later than Mintzberg and Stewart, also largely agree with them, and he found that a manager's work is largely reactive rather than proactive. So again, think back to Fayol and the PODC model that seems rational and much more proactive in terms of its orientation. And he found that managers behave the opposite of that in a more reactive, in other words, reacting to problems or issues in the workplace. He found that their behavior, their activity was varied, it was fragmented, it was frequently interrupted. Sounds familiar, right? He also concluded that interpersonal skills were of paramount importance. So their activity was frenetic, disjointed, using informal methods of disseminating and collecting information, and that they had to heavily rely on their political skills. So they exercised power and replenished their power through management, through the management of their interpersonal networks. So a very especially the more senior you get, the more this management is about aligning yourselves with the powers that be and then organizing your own power base. Because that's where, and this actually jives with, and I probably should have had a slide on a guy named Jackal around the same time in the 1980s, who basically agreed that uh, management in the organizational hierarchy was a game of influence and power and being in the aligned with the right interests at the right time and kind of like a Game of Thrones sort of thing. Actually, that's a good analogy. I like that. I'll use that again. Okay, here's another guy that's a bit like Fayol. He's not a researcher and he's not doing uh, um, uh, arm's length research. Um, he's basically using his own idiosyncratic experience to describe what a manager should do. Notice how I've emphasized the word should in this PowerPoint. So it's really almost a moralistic. I think you probably could say it is a moralistic sort of perspective on management rather than a rational description of what managers actually do. He's prescribing. He's saying here, and so he's think about this now. He's working from deep within the American centric notion of capitalism and the American centric notion of managerialism. And so he sees the world in a very particular kind of way. And trust me when I say that getting people who work in that environment to see the world in a different way is like, well, it's difficult. It's they are so glued and so functionalist in their approach that it's virtually impossible for them to develop any kind of um, uh, arm's length, any kind of critical distance from the topic. And so he's deeply embedded in the American project, the business project, and so he says things like, well, managers put economic performance first. Financial performance is what they mean there, of course. Think back to what I said earlier about the manager's job is to maximize shareholder wealth. So he's basically advocating for that. And their job is to make a productive enterprise. I can't disagree with that, but there are other purposes for an enterprise, and to manage workers and work. Of course, what's missing there is that sometimes managing people requires loosening the reins. Again, think back to the analogy I used earlier of that management essentially comes from the Greek word, phrase, verb, whatever it is, to manage horses. And what happens when you loosen the reins on a horse? Does the horse stop functioning? If it's well trained, it probably and well prepared, it probably does some pretty amazing things on its own through its own creativity. Well, so do people, or at least they have the potential to do it. So think about that. Anyway, so there's a link. I hope the link still works, but if it doesn't, oh well. There's another formative study. Formative means that it is a prior experience or time that helped to shape the individual or the organization or the institution. And so this is another one of those times when in the formative context of management and organization and business, in which certain sort of characteristics of these ideas is becoming embedded. Now you might notice the date, 1945. So this is right at the end of the Second World War. And the Second World War is notable for a number of reasons, like the number of dead, for one, and the turmoil it caused the world. But it also represented a time when management came to the forefront in terms of its attributing success to the work of management. And in particular, management science really moved to the head of the line here, because so much of the work that was being done was about logistics. How do we get soldiers, sailors, airmen, and their airplanes and their bullets and bombs and tanks and so on, and Coca-Cola to the front line so they can perform their jobs. And so that was a job of logistics. And so in military terms, logistics is kind of like a big deal. And some graduates from business school end up being officers in that functional area of the military. I've had several students go that direction. So anyway, Burnham in 1945 argued that a managerial revolution had come about. Here he is at the end of the war. Managerial skill and knowledge had become crucial to successful, large, and complex businesses and bureaucracies. Again, think military. And profits are prerequisites for high managerial income and status. So, if you think back again to the purpose of management is to maximize shareholder wealth. So managers are often rewarded on the basis of how wealthy they make the shareholders. Again, think of the incentive for managers to tip the scales away from workers and the environment and the community in favor of the shareholders. There's a huge incentive when their compensation system is set up for one purpose only, to maximize shareholder wealth. So now, based on what we've seen so far, think about these questions. What can we conclude about management? And I think if you go back to Stewart and Mintzberg and whoever else that came after, Cotter, I guess, and I think there may be a couple more researchers mentioned in your textbook, but think about the conclusions that they seem to agree on, and then think about how much power has to do with management and the accumulation of power, the organization, the coordination of power. And again, I wish I had prepared a slide on a guy named Jackal. He really did an amazing job of understanding the alignments of power in an organization, and his his book, and I can't think of the name of the book now. If I can find it, I'll mention it to you in class. And then think about how this power is created and maintained by society. Well, like you're sitting in an institution getting a BBA that basically is deeply deeply embedded in your program is the application of power, or at least the potential for the application of power. So what about these other organizations that where the power is redistributed, like to workers as an example, and they work? So uh, be careful about how you think about power and and about your use, arbitrary use of power. That's what that's what makes you a nasty manager, by the way. The one-sided and arbitrary use of power in the workplace. Um, that's why we have law, by the way. There are a number of different laws governing the workplace, particularly because managers are so prepared to take advantage of the power that has been, bequeathed to them by the hierarchy. Anyway, and then also think about um, the issue of presenteeism. We hear this in the news actually just in the last couple of weeks again and again. The idea that workers have to be at work because the only way that managers feel comfortable managing people is if they're right in front of them. Presenteeism is seen as a marker of productivity, but in fact we know it isn't. But it's what makes managers comfortable, and managers often mark themselves by staying long hours at the office, just so everybody says, "Oh, look, the boss is still at the desk, and there's his light on," and so they're attempting to manipulate and manage the sense of power. Okay, so let's move on now to what it's like to be a middle manager. So this would be somebody somewhere between the front line, the foreman, the supervisor, and the executive office. They're in that middle ground, right? And in fact, over the past say 4 decades or so, the middle manager has been the one who has faced probably some of the most challenging workplace conditions of all workers. Um, why do I say that? Well, let's just read some of the PowerPoint and you will find out. So first of all, in the middle of the middle managers are in the middle of a long hierarchy, sometimes very long, although the hierarchy has shortened um, over the past 4 decades or so. It's called flattening the organization. So this is part of that challenge that middle layers of management have been parts of the organization that have been removed, frequently removed, in order to make the organization smaller, hopefully more cost effective, but also hopefully more efficient. So instead of communications going down through a long hierarchy from top to bottom and then back up from the bottom to the top again, the distance for communications gets shortened when you remove a layer or two of management. And unfortunately, those are people with jobs who their positions are being removed from the organization. Um, and then what they're hoping to do in this flattened organization is to increase employee involvement. So if you don't have a long hierarchy, tall hierarchy, with lots of layers passing direction on to the layers below them, then it needs greater, in theory at least, it needs greater involvement and engagement of the employees further down in the hierarchy because they don't necessarily have a director, a manager to tell them, to direct them in what to do. So they have to be more able to move, make decisions and carry out activities more or less on their own. Um, this is actually a big deal in Western militaries today. In fact, the militaries have traditionally been built on a very long, tall hierarchy with lots of layers of management. But Western militaries have become much more effective. And not that I want to promote military effectiveness so much, but they become more effective because so much power is embedded at the front end of, the pointy end of the stick, so to speak, of the military, so that, sergeants and master sergeants and so on, non-commissioned officers are able to make quite a number of decisions on their own, um, so that, they're able to respond to evolving and emerging contexts. As things change on the ground, they're able to respond more effectively. By effectiveness, I mean primarily, I would think, like on a timely basis, rather than waiting to be told what to do. So yeah, we've moved from this sort of very tall hierarchy to something that's much smaller, and the one of the areas that is, paid that price is the middle manager. And but also think about the middle manager having to to deal with conflicting expectations of both those above them and those below them. So they become squeezed between, the strategies and tactics that are being pushed down from the top, and also the workers from the bottom who push back when these things don't make sense. So they're filled with things like frustration, disillusionment. They express frustration, dissatisfaction, powerlessness. I mean, these are managers. Wait a second. Aren't managers the ones with all the power? Well, if you're in the middle, you may have very little power and yet feel the exercise of power from both the bottom and the top. And so middle managers, may not expect a lifetime career in middle management anymore. It's an area of burnout, place of burnout. And of course, middle management was, as I've alluded to already, was under attack in the 80s and 90s, about 4 decades plus ago, as organizations downsized and re-engineered. So in the early 1980s, business in North America felt the pressure of the upstarts in places like Japan and Korea, and their very early success in automotives and electronics and things like that. And so they felt the need to respond, and the need to not do business the same old way. And so one of the ways to do that was to try to cut costs and create an organization that was more responsive to changes in the environment. And so shortening and removing, the middle management was a way of doing that. Okay, so I apologize for the lawnmower in the background. I have a neighbor who just seems to love to mow his lawn, but I think he's actually being browbeat by his wife into doing something productive. So anyway, sorry about that. Hopefully you can't hear much of it. Anyway, so success in management, over that 4 decades or so has really changed quite a bit. We've seen the end of lifetime employment guarantees, but this is for all workers really, but especially for middle managers. We've seen changes in the normal sort of career progression expectations. So in a tall hierarchy, there can be a lot of room for vertical progress for, say, a manager who starts, near the bottom and then progresses up through the hierarchy. But in a shorter, a flatter organization, there are fewer levels of the hierarchy, fewer levels of management, and so there are fewer opportunities to move up through the company ladder. So your career progression expectations would have been modified. And salary and rank can correlate with career satisfaction for men in particular, but we may see a difference for women. So speaking of women, let's move on to the notion of management and how it has been deeply embedded in a sense of masculinity. When most of the managers are men for a long, long, long time, and women still only make up a tiny portion of management, then you can probably imagine, at least one mechanism of why management is seen as a masculine pursuit, and that masculine characteristics might define what a good manager is. If there aren't many women who are, in management to begin with, there are fewer success stories, and the differences in their management styles and tools, may not seep into the general consciousness of what makes a good manager. So we have these inherently gendered assumptions about what makes a good management. Um, as I mentioned, I think in the last module, uh, even at the senior levels, like in the executive suite or on the board of directors, women only make up about 20%. So there's a heavy, still today, a heavy um, preponderance of testosterone in the areas of management, and men tend to behave like men. Quite often, there's a macho-ness to them. Some of these descriptions are depictions of managers as captains of industry. Well, captain is sort of a military or nautical or other, the captain of the ship is, traditionally a man. That's only really changed in the last little while. And so we use these sort of masculinized ways of describing. We talk about managers as if they're macho. In fact, think about some of the world leaders today, like Donald Trump, or whoever is leading Venezuela or Brazil. Actually, there's a Brazilian judge who is, oh my God, he is just, whoa, holy crap. Anyway, just think about world leaders and the macho that seems to define the way they behave. The hyper masculinity, the ruthlessness, the brutality, the aggressiveness, and there's a movie called what's it called? It's Michael Douglas and Charlie Sheen, a very young Charlie Sheen, and what was it called? Anyway, Michael Douglas, he has a famous line in that movie, and if I can think of it, I'll show it on YouTube, where he says, "Greed is good." Anyway, okay, so it was an interesting movie, especially for its time, and especially for a guy like Charlie Sheen. Anyway, and again, think about, we live in a society that's supposed to value democracy, and here's a kind of organization that values autocracy, and rulers, really, senior managers who are, rugged individuals who insist on the divine right to manage and insist on everybody behaving just like they do. Anyway, so there's a masculine ethic, and that ethic is raised, it's elevated as necessary for management. The masculine ethic is invoked in order to exclude women from management. And I of course I have a master's degree in business as well as my PhD, and I have your degree as well, a BBA. And but I remember quite vividly, how women were treated in our MBA program, and there's I think this article still works, from the New York Times, and it describes women's experience at Harvard. Even a vaunted managerial school like Harvard Business School. The treatment of women is really quite reprehensible, and it continues. So here is a very powerful metaphor used to describe the barriers that women face in their progress up the hierarchy. It's called the glass ceiling. And I probably should have attached an article on other forms, other versions of glass ceiling. But so there are other metaphors used to describe different aspects of this barrier to women's progress. But the glass ceiling, think about the metaphor itself. So you're looking up, and you can see the top of the organization because the ceiling above you is glass. You can see through the ceiling. But you can't, because it's a hard barrier, you can't make your way through the glass ceiling. So you can see up there, but you can't make your way up there. So it's essentially an invisible barrier that prevents women from progress up the organizational hierarchy. So while women, as I think I pointed out in module 1 or 2, women are 2, I guess it would be. No, 1. I think it was 1. No, it was 2. Sorry. Women are, have made up still make up a large proportion of the growth in the workforce. So if the workforce is growing, and it is, more of the growth is made up of women than of men. More women are moving into, and that's been a trend generally, say for the last 4 or 5 decades. I assume it continues, but I haven't seen the very latest figures. But certainly it continued up until into the last decade or so. Um, but still, they're underrepresented in higher management. They're underrepresented in the board of directors, and they earn less. So, and when I say they earn less, stop thinking, oh, well, he didn't take into account, oh, their education or their experience. No, we know from studies that take account of all these other possible explanations that women are still paid less. So there is apparently a labor market differentiation between men and women that isn't based on their actual ability to do the job. It's because they're women that they get paid less. And here's another, I don't think I've explained this to you guys yet, but a dirty little secret of small universities like Acadia and a couple of others I've taught at. A dirty little secret is that you can hire a woman for less than you can hire a man. So if you're trying to save money on your budget, you hire women. There's an incentive to hire women. Now, that may sound like a good thing, but then those women are making less money than the men. So it's still a disadvantage, economically at least. Isn't that interesting? So more on the reality for women managers in Canada. So we know that there's been a sort of stalling out of women's opportunities in senior management, and it isn't it interesting that Canada has a national goal of reaching 30% women on boards, in senior management and on boards in particular, and uh, but 30%. Wait a second, women make up roughly 50% of the workforce. Why would we be satisfied with 30%? But it's so much better than 20% that 30% seems like a reasonable target. So when I talk to you, when I mention to you, for instance, that, and I have in class that our new prime minister at the time, Justin Trudeau, in 2015, he deliberately chose half of his cabinet from among his women caucus. So the caucus is like all the members of parliament who were voted, to represent their ridings in Ottawa, and then from that group of, I don't know, 100, probably close to 150 to 200, I think, something like that, he had to choose about 50 to be essentially the managers of government, managers and junior managers and stuff like that. So that's the cabinet. These are important posts in Canada. So he deliberately chose that his cabinet was half built from the women who were elected in the most recent election. Now this just made men, not all men, but many men, like Jordan Peterson as an example. I've heard him talk about this, and I've had students who were just like could not believe that I could support Justin Trudeau in hiring, or appointing, half of his cabinet from his female caucus. And why that kind of reaction? My response to them, by the way, was there was one particular young guy in my OB class a number of years ago, and he just couldn't. Why shouldn't they be hired on the basis of merit? And I said, well, first of all, tell me which of those women is unqualified for the job. And of course, he didn't have anything to say. I continued, show me which one doesn't have the ability to be a cabinet minister. Any of them. Tell me which one. Give me any example. And then secondly, so, of course, there's no comeback to that. And then secondly, I said, the being in government is not competing in the 100 meters, I was going to say dash, the 100-meter sprint at the Olympics. It's government is government. Half of the population of Canada is made up of women. Is a government made up of only men, as an example? Let's use the extreme, ridiculous example. Is a government half made up of men going to do a good job for women's concerns? And all you have to do, and you can, if you know Canadian politics at all, you'll know what a ridiculous claim that would be. But look south of the border to what's going on in the debate between a man, Donald Trump, a really, really stupid man, by the way, and the Democratic candidate, a woman, Harris. And think about, which one, if you're 50%, if you're a member of 50% of the population, which one would you want as your president? Now, what really just riles me so badly is that apparently as many as 50% of white women in the US voted for that skunk, Trump. 50%. Like, what is wrong with you women? And 70% of white men. So in class, I mentioned one day, I think, how embarrassed I am for both my race and my sex. The white men in the U.S. are completely, well, almost completely, because I guess there were 30% who didn't vote for him. But they seem almost completely self-absorbed with their own interests and not with the better interest of society and their nation. And so when Trudeau appoints half of his cabinet from his female caucus, I'm like standing up and cheering like mad. He's making me proud to be a Canadian. And then after that, he even doubled down on it. His deputy prime minister was a woman, and that woman also became the minister of finance. And another woman became the Minister of Foreign Affairs. That's Melanie Joly. And then another woman became the Minister for National Defense. Her name was Anita Anand. And I think there was a very special reason why Anita Anand was made. I know, in fact, there was a very special reason why she was named the Minister for National Defense. And the reason was that our military, like the RCMP, have been almost made decrepit by the horrible masculinist culture that just is terrible toward both women and anybody different than white men. And so she was sent in, she's a lawyer, she was sent in essentially to try to straighten it out, to provide, and I know she couldn't do it all on her own in a short period of time, but to try to provide a mechanism so that more complaints against the all-white, all-male hierarchy of the military could be brought to heel, could be taken to task for their bad behavior. I don't know to what extent she has been successful, and she's been replaced, by the way, as Minister of Defense by a white man. And so I don't know what the reason was for that. I don't know enough about it, but I suspect that she did what she could, and then she was moved out. And I hope that will make some difference over the long haul. But that's something I have not had time to follow up on. So another concept that's used to describe the experience of women, in particular Black and ethnic minority women managers in the workplace, is called double jeopardy. And just as it's not a game like the TV program Jeopardy. It is that women, Black women and ethnic minority women in particular, face jeopardy times two in the workplace. Once because they're not white, and another time because they're not men. So in fact, they sort of face this double whammy. Now, you may have, in one of your other classes, like if you study with Dr. Dye or Dr. Price, you may in one of your other classes hear the concept of intersectionality. So this is another sort of more academic phrase for describing double jeopardy. It's the idea that we can understand something about the social relations based on race and sex and so on by looking at where these categories or where these memberships, these identities, where they intersect. So think about, and in class I probably will do this in class. I don't have it prepared for this lecture, but imagine a 2x2 matrix where on one axes of the matrix you have sex, so you have male and female, and then on the other axes you have black or white or non-white. That's a four cell matrix, 2x2 matrix. Then think about who has the greatest privilege if you assigned people to the cells in that matrix. So one of those cells is described as men and white, and another cell is men and not white, and then another cell is women and white, and the final cell is not white women. And so, and then think about the people who are in those, could be assigned to those various categories, and think about the barriers that they face to participation in the workplace. And I draw your attention in particular to the illustration I'll use in class is to look at pilots, air crew in the Second World War. There were if you go to the theater, if you watch movies at all, you're probably aware that there are several movies actually about black representation in the Air Force in World War II. And there's one movie in particular about the Red Tails, which was a fighter squadron made up of black pilots, but they never got to go into combat. They always flew sort of out of combat on the edges, sort of thing. And the part of the point of the movie was that when they finally got their chance, they showed just how good they could be. But because they were black, their opportunity was withheld from them, while the white males flew the high priority missions and the high visibility missions. And then women weren't. If you go in the other direction to white women or women in general, women were relegated to non-combat altogether. In fact, women would be ferrying combat aircraft into the combat theater, but they'd have to do it without ammunition. Because of course they were women, they can't be issued ammunition, and yet they'd get into combat nevertheless because the enemy would find them as they're ferrying these airplanes in to whatever forward bases. So they'd get into trouble, but they wouldn't have any ammunition because they were women. And then think about the intersection of women and the color of your skin, which is that sort of fourth quadrant. And so imagine how you're disadvantaged as a woman or as a black man, and then picture black women in that fourth quadrant. Like what would they have to do to get any kind of job experience that would be valued after the war? They were withheld from getting job experience. So when people talk about merit, as an example, I know I'm digressing a bit here, but when people talk about merit, what they don't understand is that how many people have been denied the ability to acquire merit, the experience or the training or whatever it is, because of the color of their skin or because of where their sex organs are located. It's not rational. It's based on sex and the color of your skin. And so that's, as I mentioned, it's a phenomenon called double jeopardy, and we quite often explore it in a sort of format called intersectionality, and it's a way to keep women, another way to keep women out of the workplace, positions of power. So this is a kind of a fun little topic, fun in a way, except that there are really bad outcomes that can result from management work, but also very good examples that can emerge as well. So, what about surprises in our management work? Surprises are sudden or unexpected phenomenon that emerge. They're emergent. They aren't necessarily expected or even considered as possible outcomes, and so it's a problem for managers because they tend to prize predictability and especially control. So when workers don't do exactly as management wants them to do, and then they talk back to managers or they make suggestions to managers or any of a number of different behaviors that they may exhibit, managers are quite often likely to exert their control over the workers with threats or discipline or a whole range of things. Like managers often become control freaks in a sense. So the managers also have a tendency, and these are people who are either very experienced or trained in management, right? They went to business school like you guys. And there may be a tendency among managers to overestimate the degree of control they have and the degree of predictability. Um, Managers also, and again, I point to the idea that it is possible to problematize management, even though almost nobody in business studies does it, with my exception, me anyway, and a few others. Um, we're, what gets hidden up is a tremendous amount of ignorance, a tremendous amount of incompetence gets hidden and it's not examined. But all you have to do, and not examined in a formal sense in the business academy, but all you have to do is check the headlines on a daily basis. And if you don't see stuff popping up in the headlines, you're not really looking. That's relevant to what we're saying here. And then see also, accidents that happen in places like Bhopal, India, two space shuttle disasters, Chernobyl nuclear power plant that melted down that's in the north of Ukraine, which is kind of crazy. Here's a country at war, and they're also sitting on some of the hottest, literally like nuclear hot land in the world as well, and airline crashes and so on. And interestingly, many of these really, really bad events took place while managers denied the clear warnings. The stuff that's going on at Boeing right now, as an example, like doors flying off and planes falling out of the sky. And I don't know, no, who made, no, it was Northrop Grumman, I think, that built the space shuttles. At NASA, managers, or I should say, engineers at NASA knew the limits of the space shuttle and warned about disaster. But management overrode their concerns and continued with the activities of the space shuttle. And 14 people were killed in two different accidents because of management. Not because of engineering or something like that, but because management made such incompetent decisions. I can't call it anything else but incompetence. Because they felt pressured, they felt pride, they felt ego, they felt masculinity. We have to launch, we have to launch, we have to be bold, we have to, whatever other words they used, sort of hyper masculinized sense of strength and courage and so on. And yet, their actions, their decisions killed 14 highly trained astronauts in two different accidents. So what happens if we stand back from management and take an arm's length or a critical look at management? And so one thing I think we can conclude is that there is no one best way to manage. I've tried to provide examples to you of successful management organizations that use wildly different kinds of management relations. And uh, actually, an interesting quote from a guy named Hyman. Rather, only partial routes to failure. The way I would describe what he's trying to describe here is that management feels a need, and I've described this in class to you, but feels a need to be decisive, action oriented. And they develop in their management studies, at the undergraduate level, like you guys, and at the graduate level, like MBAs, they develop a glibness about their ability to control and predict and do the right thing. And in fact, the opposite is as often true. Um, and part of the reason for that is that what they're trying to do, what they're trying to control, outcomes they're trying to achieve, are incredibly complex because they're part of the social world. It's not like, physics, or where you can predict, because, the theory and uh, and the outcomes of science, they work to very high levels of likelihood. Um, it's actually quite remarkable how heavy a load that the physicists carry before they'll make a finding. And uh, and then the other thing about managerial work, and this goes for your management professors as well, your business professors as well, that they imagine the world that they're studying to be highly structured, and so they're trying to understand the structure underneath, and they get very excited over a structure that really doesn't explain much. Frequently, in many of the equations that they work out, they are looking at maybe 5 to 8% of ability to predict an outcome. 5 to 8%. That's like a 1 in 20, 1 in 10, 1 in 20 chance to predict something validly. That's what? That's kind of weird, right? Well, that's because they're studying social relations, not physics. It's so applying the concepts of physics to social reality, that's problematic. That's what I was trying to tell you a couple of weeks ago in class. Um, and Whether managers are able or willing to overcome the obstacles that stand in the way of constructing a more meaningful work environment remains to be seen. This is Wilson. This is our textbook, an earlier edition. Managers have not demonstrated that they are always up to the task. And not even, I would argue, not even a majority of the time. I'd start at 50% and work your way up or down. I'm not sure which way. But they're not very good at what they do. And it's not because they're bad people. And it's not because they're well, it may be because they're poorly educated, but they know all the techniques. Generally speaking, I assume they know all the techniques. But what they don't understand is what they're trying to do is so complex, and that maybe they need to take a step back, that critical distance, and think about other ways of seeing the problem, which tends to be things that are not technique oriented. Things like, the relations between race and sex and gender and so on. And most managers are not very, including your business professors and the ones who choose to be managers in the business school, for instance, they're not very good at that stuff. Little secret, just between you and me. Before I break with this slide, um, so there are your textbook talks, and I like this definition too of how to understand management. So let's ask the question: which is the right perspective for management to take? And I think it depends to some extent, but the three that are described in your textbook are the unitary, the pluralist, and the radical. And so let me explain what each of these is on this slide and the next. So first of all, the unitary perspective or unitarist perspective assumes that management and workers are striving together to achieve common goals, that they see the problems of organization in the same way, through a similar perspective. Right off the bat, hopefully you can see that could be, based on what I've been telling you, but that could be problematic, because workers have much different needs and desires than managers do, right? Like, how am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to send my kids to university? How am I going to put food on the table? How am I going to make the next car payment? And so on, right? So managers' jobs appear to be about most efficient and effective means of bringing about common good. And I put common good in parentheses here because I'm being a little bit facetious, because that's the management assumption that they're doing what is in the common good. But if it leaves out the needs of the worker, then that's not the common good. So that they're pursuing common interests and objectives. And so why don't workers just go along with what we're telling them? And so there are a number of reasons for that. One is that maybe people don't like to be bossed around. They don't like to be controlled. Maybe they like to be engaged and involved in the decision making. Maybe they think what you're doing is just out and out wrong. Maybe you're breaking the law. There are so many reasons why management is a problem. So that's the unitary perspective. And by the way, workers, when they disagree with managers, are quite often seen to be problematic. They're mentally ill. Maybe they're troublemakers. Maybe they don't belong here. If you ever hear somebody describe an employee as a good team player, run the other way, because team players are people who just agree with everything no matter what. And you probably don't want to work in that kind of organization. You probably want to work in an organization where differences can be surfaced and dealt with, not where they build up and build resentment and the intent to get the hell out of there. Okay. So the first perspective really suggests the second perspective. If the world is not unitarist, if we don't all see social reality the same way, then maybe we see social reality, including, the business reality, in numerous ways, in a number of different ways, which we refer to as the pluralist, plural as in multiple. Managers have political interests. I mentioned that before about, how that much of what we think goes on in organizations has been well documented, actually, is about the management of power, the accumulation, the manipulation of power, and so on, right? And so they play political games. Politics is essentially, small p politics is really essentially about power. And so any organization, any institution uh, has its own little, political games being played. So managers' rhetoric is political, often political. They demonstrate commitment through long hours in order to impress. Well, it's not necessary for the job. As I mentioned before, there's this idea of presenteeism. Why aren't you present? Why aren't you always here working? There's a conflict between management and workers that is endemic. It's not just workers don't want to get along. It's that they're, and I think I explained this in class as well, using the sort of teeter-totter of the balance of power between workers and management. And there's managers are in control. They are in that part of the hierarchy, unless you're in an alternative form of organization like a worker co-op. So they have the dominant hand. They have the power, right? Or in Seinfeldian terms, they have hand. And so they're always in the process of gaining consent for their view. They are often constraining conflict, trying to prevent disaster and maintain control all at the same time. So what this suggests is that with all these different perspectives in the workplace, um, the unitary perspective is probably an unobtainable ideal, an unrealistic ideal, and maybe a naive and childlike ideal. So if you're a manager who gets angry at workers for not agreeing with you, then that could be kind of childlike, could be seen as childlike. And then finally, I've talked about the radical perspective before, and the radical perspective, which is essentially the worker perspective, turning the social relations of the organization upside down, essentially putting workers on top instead of managers. Uh, we get a much different view of the organization. We get division of labor, first of all. So this is in your textbook, you'll see a guy named Braverman talked about how the management is really the level at which thinking is essentially granted a license, right? You guys are the ones who do the planning, you do the thinking, and then the others, the workers down below you, they're the ones who do. So it's in a sense a division of labor around thinking and doing. And so that is remember that term alienation. So if you're going to become alienated, it may just be because somebody else is making decisions for you, designing the jobs and the tasks for you, setting the performance parameters for you, giving you feedback based on their understanding and not your understanding. And so there is this deep divide between thinking and doing. That is really a power divide. Um, so this kind of analysis is most closely associated with Marxism, which I have talked about. Post-colonial theory. In post-colonialism, there's a huge power divide between the colonizers, the white Europeans who come along and put the indigenous people, the local people, to work in North America, Africa, South America, Australia, wherever it is, even Asia, and so there's the division of power, and the thinking is done by the white Europeans, and the doing is done by the brown or black locals, and then the transfer of knowledge virtually does not exist. So in the 1950s, when decolonization of Africa in particular really started to take hold, as an example, the locals, the black people who lived in these various countries that were now formerly colonies, they hadn't been allowed to develop the skills. And remember that thing about merit, how merit, oh, we got to do it on the basis. Well, what if the people that you're judging for hiring or whatever, for engagement in your organization, what if they've never been given the opportunity to engage those skills, use those skills, develop those skills? Again, I mean, it's a repeating theme, isn't it? So that's what we refer to as post-colonialism. And I work in post-colonialism. I just had a paper published earlier this year, this is 2024, by the way, and so on. So what we conclude, I think, one of the things we can conclude anyway, is that who does what reflects the structure of power relations in society and in the organization, not who is functionally better able to do it. Who has more merit to do it. Right. So, here's a better description of what I'm trying to explain between the top of the hierarchy and the bottom of the hierarchy. So managers who have jobs with challenge, responsibility, and so on, kind of jobs I hope you guys get, they design jobs for those lower in the hierarchy, jobs with lower discretion, autonomy, control. And jobs where you have to do and not think, and don't talk back. Remember conditioning? Those are the kinds of jobs you're developing for folks at the lower end of the organization, of the hierarchy. And managers spend an awful lot of time maintaining their social advantage, strengthening networks and coalitions and so on, and making sure they're aligned with the right powers in the organization. Maybe the powers that they think are in the ascendancy. The dominant powers. You see an awful lot of back scratching and butt kissing and all that sort of stuff. However, managers they can't be everywhere. That's what omniscient means. They can't be everywhere. So they face resistance and other even more troubling dilemmas. Think of the strikes that are going on right now at Boeing. Actually, there's a big strike going on at Boeing. The law professors at McGill University are on strike right now, and I actually, here it is a Friday, and I wish I was up there walking the line with them instead of doing this for you guys. So it's a theme that we can return to in coming chapters. It's a recurring theme. So we've covered a lot of ground in this chapter, honestly. I mean, this is not as much detail maybe as I could have provided, but a lot of ground. We went right from the 1920s or 1920s and 30s all the way through to till today. And so what have we learned? Well, first of all, early thinkers in management, and like some of my textbooks and some of yours even to a lesser extent, but certainly my textbooks several decades ago, the early thinkers in management, they sought to be rational and to apply rational scientific practices to organization. We even still call some of these programs, science degrees in management, and which is kind of ludicrous, but anyway, they persist. And there's a view that we can maximize performance, that we can reach a higher and higher level. And when in fact maybe what we should be looking at is just a good level of performance, and make sure that we're also succeeding at other outcomes like social outcomes. Some of the co-ops that I am a real big fan of, and I've visited over the years, including the Mondragon, which I've told you about, and the ceramic flooring company in Bologna, or outside, just outside Bologna, Italy, and the doors and windows company. They're in places like where they're located, the unemployment rate, as another outcome that should be valued, another success story. The unemployment rate in those places is a third or a half of what it is in the rest of the country. In Italy, for instance, when I visited there, the unemployment rate in the north central and northeastern part of Italy was around 3.5, 4%, I think it was, and the unemployment rate in Italy on a whole was 10.5, 11%, I think. Most recently, when I was in Spain, northern Spain, that's a few years now, but the unemployment rate at that time was around 12% in the northeastern part of Spain. That's up where the Mondragon is located, and which sounds pretty high, except when you understand that the general unemployment rate in Spain was 25%. I don't even know how a country functions with 25% unemployment, but I guess being part of the European Union probably made up for some of that. So there are other outcomes other than the bottom line which matter. And if you're only concerned, if your narrow perspective is the maximization of wealth, then you're not considering those other outcomes. So get your head out of your ass and start questioning the stuff you're studying in your business program. There are other ways of doing and studying business. Oh, I should continue too that I have mentioned this in class, I think, to some of you at least, that one of the assumptions underlying this sort of rational approach is that organizations should be treated like machines. And, a well-oiled machine will produce, good, controllable, predictable results, good managerial outcome. But and think of McDonald's as an example of a machine. But if we operated, if McDonald's continued to operate their businesses like machines, how long do you think they'd have employees? If you're only being treated like a cog in the machine, you're not going to last very long there. You're not going to enjoy being treated like a piece of machinery. And so we need more sympathetic and broader based metaphors to talk about management and business knowledgeably and considerately. And this is actually a big problem, that people are still considered variable and unreliable. And so when I talk about, I ride the fence on this one a little bit. When I talk about the emergence of humanoid robots as an example, I'm conflicted about this, because on the one hand, the reason they will capture so much of the labor market is because managers would rather get rid of people because they are variable and unreliable, and they can hire a machine that will essentially do their jobs more reliably for more hours in the day for less pay. You still have to rent or buy the machine, so there would still be a cost associated with them. But generally speaking, they're after efficiency, and they're after control, and so getting rid of people is for many managers is of paramount concern. It's already well underway, of course. This isn't a new thing, but with the advent of incredibly intelligent and capable, and they will be, trust me, watch in the next year or so, just how capable these machines will be. Then why wouldn't you consider getting rid of people? It's rational. But then what does humanity do? What do people do to earn a living so that they can have families, so that they can improve themselves, so they can maybe someday retire, and anyway, so they can express themselves, and so on and so on. And so, in a sense, this is a case of where science, may save organization, but it may destroy humanity at the same time. So I won't spend too much time on this one, but think of the early thinkers, and like Frederick Taylor. Actually, I haven't even talked about Frederick Taylor yet, but Frederick Taylor is considered the founder of scientific management. He wasn't the only person working on scientific management back in the early part of the 20th century and late 19th century, but he's given a lot of credit for it because at some point he becomes a professor he's very successful at it, and at some point he becomes a professor at Harvard University, and so he sort of makes his name, and Harvard makes its name from employing him. Um, and as I've mentioned, so scientific management, this idea that an organization can be more machine-like, and his method, I won't go into the details of his method, but his method was essentially about making each and every job, breaking it down into its sort of atomistic components, like the smallest components. Like if you're shoveling coal, how big would the shovel be? How quickly would you want the shovel to throw a load of coal? And so on and so on. Like, and he would observe, time, measure, and so on, and break the most menial jobs down into bits and pieces. Um, and so then and rebuild them in the most efficient way possible to increase productivity. And at the time, like a lot of organizations suffered greatly from a lack of productivity because they didn't do this sort of stuff. But he also recognized how dehumanizing his concept was. Here I am saying I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, and here I'm launching into a deep explanation. But anyway, he recognized how dehumanizing his concept was, his theory, and the practice of scientific management. And he was actually, in fact, an advocate for unions to represent workers because without unions, the job would not only be dehumanizing, but it would be extremely exploitive in the extreme. So they needed unions to fight for good wages and working conditions. So, hey, I bet you a lot of people don't know that. And then Ford comes along, around the same time actually, and we actually already, or today we refer to Ford's contribution to the assembly line, another sort of version of Taylorism, as Fordism, the idea that tasks could be broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller bits, and then everything put on an assembly line which controlled the speed of production, and in that way controlled the workers, and so but he found, this is again another one of those things that we sort of have to do a little more reading for. He found, of course, that again workers were running away from his plants because the work was again so dehumanizing, so monotonous, so in a sense boredom, so boring, that people were running away. And he discovered that the only way to keep them was to double their pay. And then when he increased their pay significantly, suddenly they were also buying his cars. It's like, oh, a light bulb went off. Maybe if we pay workers enough, they can actually fuel the economy. Imagine if today we paid minimum wage workers a living wage, what that would do to the economy. Imagine. Have you ever thought about that? I bet you've never thought about that, have you? And I bet you a lot of small business owners who keep complaining about increasing wages never thought about how the economy might actually be better if we paid people more, if we paid people enough to live. Sorry, I get a little excited about this. I've got a typo in here. It's not Braveman, it's Braverman. He talked about the separation of conception. I mentioned this in one of my previous slides. What was Braverman's response to the tensions between the needs of capital and needs of labor? So the separation of conception is essentially the idea that at the top of the hierarchy, managers, they conceive of how the jobs will be built, designed, and how the work will be done as a result. And then at the bottom of the hierarchy, you get workers who do. So you have a separation of conception from doing, a separation of thinking from doing. And then another thing I didn't talk about in the presentation so far is the Hawthorne experiments. And the Hawthorne was a plant of General Electric, where they manufactured stuff, electrical stuff, and electrical mechanical stuff, I guess. So he sort of, in a way, spawned the human relations movement, uh, which sounds on its face, it sounds pretty positive. But in fact, it was another way to understand how to subjugate workers, how to get them to work harder using their needs against themselves or against their work, not against themselves, against their workers. And so it's well described in your textbook. Have a look at it. I think that's actually in chapter 4, not 3. Anyway, so I'll leave it there. But one last thing to do, and that is slide 27 is about. This is an additional thing that we won't really be using until after the midterm break. So you can leave it at this point if you want. Otherwise, it's actually pretty interesting if you want to sort of nuts and bolts how to do things. Okay, so this comes from my own doctoral dissertation research. Uh, in the course of that research, I read and closely examined. I'm going to say more than 200 court cases, lawsuits from an area of law called wrongful dismissal law. So that is what happens if an employee feels that they've been unfairly dismissed from the workplace. In law, that's called a wrongful dismissal. In Canada, it's called common law, the common law of wrongful dismissal. And there are variations of this in labor law as well, and in provincial statute, provincial and federal statutes as well. The Employment Standards Act, for instance, in Ontario, and the various provincial versions of that. So I know it's very small, but I've actually got this in an original document, a Word document, under the tidbits, in the tidbits folder for this module on Acorn and Moodle. So if you need a version that you can easily reproduce, you can just find it there. Anyway, so this is the advice that came from the courts, essentially, and my close reading of all these cases. So when I say a close reading, I had to read these cases so close that I could categorize a number of different factors that arose in each case in order to statistically analyze the cases looking for structure. So many judges don't like this kind of work, and a lot of lawyers don't understand that this kind of work can be done because they've been told for so long that the legal decisions are based on the particular facts that they don't seem to understand that facts sometimes repeat themselves across cases, and so they are predictable. I won't deal with the predictability in this, what maybe in a future presentation I can do that, but it turns out that legal cases have a whole lot of predictability, and which makes sense, even though lawyers might tell you the opposite. It makes sense because if the law isn't predictable, how do we know how to apply it in the workplace? And a lot of people don't understand how predictable the law is, and so they don't understand how to apply it in the workplace. But that's the job of HR managers. HR managers understand the law, or let me say HR practitioners. They are very good at employment law, like very good. They attend all kinds of seminars on employment law. They know how to turn it into policy and practice in the workplace. And so if you're a senior manager and you do not listen to your HR manager, you're the fool. You are the fool. My experience with HR managers is that they're very good at this. They understand the concepts and they understand how to balance employees' rights. So I'm going on a bit here, but anyway, so I titled this slide "How to Conduct a Disciplinary Investigation" because it's related to discipline. Dismissal is a form of discipline in the workplace. There are other lesser forms of discipline, like a disciplinary letter, suspension, verbal reprimand. Those are disciplines, right? So this is the sort of the highest level of discipline in the workplace. But it's also a treatise on how to be a good manager, because the what the courts are saying, did you do this? Or did you, let's give me, uh, uh, so here's a manager is represented by the employer in court or by the employer's lawyer, and the court the judge may ask the manager through their judge, did you clearly understand the nature of the offense? In other words, if you're going to fire somebody, if you're going to discipline somebody, you better know what the offense was. You better know how it ties into performance and to the needs of the organization. If you don't do those things, then you've made a mistake right off the top. So that's essentially what I'm talking about. This is like, if you haven't done these things, you're going to be in trouble in court. But likewise, if you haven't done these things, you're not being a good manager. You're not really doing the things that you can do to make the workplace better for workers and for the organization. This is basics on how to manage performance. So so first of all, first sort of thing is, did you launch so imagine that somebody is accused, or there's evidence that somebody has uh, been misbehaving in some way, or their performance hasn't met standards in some way. And so you launch an investigation. Well, first of all, do it promptly. If you let an investigation lag, it's as if, in the eyes of the courts and in the eyes of employees as well, it's as if you have said, oh, well, it's not that serious. So we're not going to worry about it too much, because we're not going to investigate until, for a month or 2 or 3. And so what that communicates is that it's just you're essentially condoning the bad behavior, the bad performance, or the misconduct. And so you don't let it sit too long. Now, this is not necessarily derived from my analysis of the cases, but you have to think about who you should interview in order to get at the facts. So if you only receive the facts from, say, another manager, well, maybe you should talk to the employee, the worker, to find out if the facts match. And maybe you ought to talk to people around those two to see what the real conditions are like. So make up your mind quickly, I would say, and let it evolve as well. Like, who are you going to talk to? Who would be able to provide a valid and reliable version of facts, of the events, where the interview is conducted with care, in a sensitive and confidential manner. So if you do an interview, let's say right out in the open, and you're asking an individual all kinds of embarrassing questions, well, you're probably not going to get reliable results. So take the needs of the individual into account. Don't embarrass them. Be sensitive to their needs, and so on, right? Has the employee been given the opportunity to tell her side of the story? So this is a fundamental part of what's called natural law, or in more formal terms, procedural law. Does the accused, the person you're going to dump the discipline on, have they had a chance to have their side of the story explained, either by themselves or by a representative? D, if there is to be discipline, is there an opportunity for an unbiased hearing that follows due process? Again, this is a fundamental part of what's referred to as natural law. And by the way, natural law is called natural law, not because it's actually natural. It doesn't come from nature, but it's the principles of natural law are thought to be so obvious that they must come from nature, essentially. They don't, obviously, but because it's part of social reality, it's not part of nature. But they're thought to be so fundamental, so obvious to the objective third party, the arm's length person, that, well, of course you have to do those things. And so an unbiased hearing that follows due process, follows the rules, that's an important part of natural law. Second, determine the specific misconduct, poor performance issue that has been alleged. Do you clearly understand the nature of the offense? Is there the probability of a factual basis for the offense? How do we establish that the offense actually happened? And go back to number 1 again. And how are you going to interview people? Where are you going to gather the facts? And by the way, just like let's say that you're going to accuse somebody of not meeting uh, their performance standards. Um, there are a whole bunch of ways of determining, if those performance standards were reasonable and clearly communicated. And I think they come up in number three, actually, for the most part. And just because you have an objective measure of lack of performance doesn't mean that the employee did anything fundamentally wrong. Because we call those, sometimes we refer to those as mitigating factors that tend to lessen the seriousness of the offense. So in number three, how serious was the poor performance or misconduct? Was the employee aware they had broken a job requirement or failed to reach a standard of performance? Was the poor performance or misconduct intentional? Was it just an accident? Or did they set out to perform poorly or to misbehave? Was that an intentional act? And many times, of course, it's absolutely not. So how can you hold an employee to a certain standard when they didn't even do it, when they didn't breach the standard intentionally? It could have been an accident. It could have been, whatever, right? So another aspect of that is, did the employee benefit? So this is a similar sort of idea. If I do something, record something, let's say in the books, and it results in a benefit to me, like, maybe I squirrel the money away in, my own account or something. Well, that's a benefit to the employee. But many times these things involve no benefit to the employee. So you have to question their motivation, their intent. Well, clearly they didn't mean to breach their, their contract and their expectations. So again, it tends to mitigate the wrongness of their behavior. A really clearer indication of whether the employee, uh, um, should be punished is if they have committed the poor performance or the misconduct in the past. And so you need to look at things like, was the employee warned about the consequences of future poor performance or misconduct? Has the employer documented any corrective action plan? So sometimes employers think that just a series of warnings without any consequences might be enough. Sometimes it is, depends on the seriousness of the offense. But sometimes the courts will say, well, did you specifically warn the employee that their job was in jeopardy? Did you discipline them in the past? So discussions about, this or that, maybe you could do this, but those are not the same as discipline. They're not the same as warning, and they're not the same as the employee understanding that their job is in jeopardy. The courts are very serious about these things, right? So, and you as a manager should also be serious about doing these things to make sure that the employee understands their position. And I don't mean overdoing them. I mean, because if you overdo them, you're in just as much trouble as a manager. But doing them when it's appropriate, right? And the courts know how to evaluate these things. So is it a repeated thing? If it's repeated, you can use what's called, and we'll study this in human resource management, you can use a thing called progressive discipline. But many managers don't understand that there's a system of progressive penalties that they can use to communicate to the employee that the continued breach is serious and getting more serious as they continue the breach, because the discipline gets more serious. Okay, so what has been the quality of the employee's past performance or disciplinary record, and for how long? Have they been disciplined in the past? Have they won awards for their performance? Is their performance appraisal, if you do an annual performance appraisal, for instance, are they always positive? Do you use the performance appraisal to point out to the employee that they have deficiencies? Or do you just give them a pass, even if they have deficiencies? So if you give them a pass, even though they have deficiencies, in a sense, you're condoning their bad performance or their bad behavior. Again, the condonation is an important element of discovering whether dismissal was warranted or not. Has similar poor performance or misconduct been condoned in the past, either in the case of this employee or others? Again, I'm sort of repeating myself, but if that employee is being singled out, even though other employees have performed poorly in the same sort of way or misbehaved in a similar way, why were they not disciplined? Why is this employee being disciplined? So it has to be consistent. Discipline has to be consistent and progressive. And there's a few other words I could throw in there that I can't think of at the moment. What is the evidence of that the poor performance or misconduct materially damaged the organization? Did the employer actually suffer some kind of damage because of the employee? That's a difficult one. And many times when a manager just fires somebody because they don't like the way somebody does something, it's difficult for the employer to then turn around and say, well, they did damage us. So, it damaged our reputation. Well, demonstrate how it damaged the corporation's reputation. Show us where's the material cost associated with that damage to reputation. And so, making an allegation, a general allegation, is rarely enough. Were there any other mitigating factors? Were other employees involved? Was the employee provoked or manipulated? Did the employee refuse unsafe or unethical work? Did the employee express remorse? So this is a big one, actually. I probably should give that one its own bullet. If an employee does not show remorse for their bad behavior, as an example, or whatever it happens to be, then the courts will say, okay. And this is the same really in criminal law as well. By the way, we're talking about civil law here as opposed to criminal law. So it's a different kind of law with different kind of tests involved. But this one can be very similar. If the individual, let's say an individual is harassing young women in the workplace, and I can think of places where this happens all the time. Well, at least often enough that it should be a problem. When it's pointed out to the individual that what they're doing is against company policy or is problematic in some sense because you're making another employee uncomfortable and may even result in that person leaving our organization or certainly damaging their performance because of your behavior. If you point that out to a person and they do not acknowledge the seriousness of the issue and that their behavior could be problematic, even though it's been demonstrated to be problematic, that lack of remorse can often sink the employee. But if they do show remorse, think about this. What place does forgiveness have in employment and in the workplace? And so I think this partly at least argues for forgiveness. If an employee is willing to admit their shortcomings, that their transgression, I guess, was problematic and did damage in some way, and that they're willing and able to work on fixing that problem, then I think, in most cases, unless it's very, very serious, and it could be, I think in most cases you give that person another chance. And in fact, there are even these things called last chance agreements, an LCA, where an employer says to the employee, if that, we're willing to give you one last chance. That's a last chance agreement. We're willing to give you another chance, but if this behavior repeats itself, we're going to have to let you go. That's so you've given them warning. They know their job is in jeopardy, and they know specifically what they're not supposed to do. And by the way, you may also need to provide some support. Like in some organizations, maybe they provide awareness training about sexual harassment and bullying and things like that, so that the individual is more aware of the nature of more self-aware of the nature of their behavior and how it hurts others and maybe damages the organization. Okay, so number 4, if the employee has been disciplined for poor performance, has the employer ensured that Performance requirements are clear, reasonable, consistent, and applied fairly. That I've already spoken about some of these things, but all these matter, right? Are all employees held to the same standards? Are there discrepancies between espoused standards and actual practices? So if we say something is, uh, we don't want to see that in the workplace, but then we don't, discipline when those things happen in the workplace, then we're essentially condoning the behavior. And so we would have a hard time as the employer relying on that policy if we haven't been consistently uh, uh, practicing it. Do standards or other directions from the employer conflict? Are we telling the employee this, but also that, and those two directions, those two rules, conflict with each other in some way? Um, do you provide adequate training and support for the employee so that they can perform appropriately? Is the employee's performance demonstrably below average? Again, documentation, measurement if possible, but documentation. Has the employee been told that she is not meeting job requirements and that her job is in jeopardy? I've mentioned that already. Does the employee understand what is required to achieve satisfactory performance? So you've told them that they're not performing to standard. So how do they get to the standard? What do they need to do? What are they missing? And have you provided the support to get them to that standard? The employee had reasonable time to learn the job and to improve. So there are lots of examples where employees get fired, but they didn't even have an opportunity to learn the job properly. Um, and this is an important one. Is their performance improving? If it's improving, you'd have to say, well, give them time to learn the job. Reasonable time, that is. And then finally, has the employee experienced a recent change of job duties or other conditions of the job, especially if the change was imposed by the employer? How much time do we get and how much support do we get to change our performance? So I'll leave it off there. That's a that is a long presentation. And so that last little bit especially is optional.